She is 87 years old. She lives in San Bernardino County, California, one of the most medically troubled regions in the United States. The county has some of the highest rates of obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease in the state. The air quality is among the worst in California, a product of decades of vehicle traffic and industrial emissions settling into the valley between the mountains. The food environment surrounding her home is a standard American suburban landscape: fast food chains, convenience stores, processed food available at every corner. She has lived here her entire life. She takes no medication for cardiovascular disease. Her blood pressure is normal. Her fasting glucose is normal. She tends her garden every morning, walks to her community center 3 times a week, and eats a meal that would look familiar to any Seventh-day Adventist in this small California city. A meal her mother made and her grandmother before that. She is not exceptional in Loma Linda. She is ordinary. The city of Loma Linda sits in the heart of San Bernardino County, surrounded by the same environmental stressors that produce some of the worst health outcomes in California. And yet, inside this same geography, a community of approximately 9,000 Seventh-day Adventists produces longevity outcomes that no other American population has ever matched. Women in this community live an average of 6 years longer than California women. Men live 9 years longer than California men. Loma Linda is the only blue zone in the United States, the only one in a country of 330 million people. The researchers who have spent decades studying this community consistently arrive at the same conclusion. The longevity advantage is not the California climate. It is not access to better healthcare. It is not favorable genetics. It is a set of specific daily habits, practiced consistently across a lifetime, reinforced by a community that does the same, that produces a biological outcome that the surrounding population, breathing the same air and driving the same roads, never achieves. 5 of those habits are documented so specifically in the Adventist Health Studies that researchers were able to isolate their individual contribution to longevity outcomes, not as correlations, as independent variables with measurable effect sizes. I am going to show you all 5. And at the end, I am going to tell you something about what these women do not consume. An absence so consistent and so complete that it may explain more than any single habit on this list. Stay until the end, because the absence piece changes how you think about everything else. Habit 1. Tomatoes, 3 to 4 times a week. This is the finding from the Adventist Health Studies that most surprised the research team when it first emerged. Not the legumes, not the nuts. Tomatoes. Adventist women who consume tomatoes at least 3 to 4 times per week showed a 70% reduction in ovarian cancer risk compared to those who ate them less frequently. 70%. From a vegetable that costs under $1 and appears in every California garden and every grocery store in the country. The finding was specific to women, specific to frequency, and specific enough that the researchers published it separately from the broader dietary pattern data. The mechanism runs through lycopene, the carotenoid that gives tomatoes their red color, and that functions as one of the most potent antioxidants in the dietary literature for hormone-sensitive tissues. Lycopene is fat-soluble, which means its bioavailability increases dramatically when tomatoes are cooked with oil. A fresh tomato delivers some lycopene. A cooked tomato sauce with olive oil delivers 4 to 5 times more absorbable lycopene to the tissues that need it. The Adventist women were not supplementing lycopene. They were cooking tomatoes into their daily meals, in sauces, in soups, in simple cook preparations, because that was simply how vegetables were prepared. The biology reflected what consistent lycopene delivery looks like in ovarian tissue across decades of daily cooking. Habit 2. Water, 5 to 6 glasses every day. This is the most ignored finding in the entire Adventist Health Study literature. Not the most dramatic, not the most counterintuitive, but the most consistently overlooked by the popular health media that has covered the Blue Zone research for 2 decades. Men in the Adventist Health Study, one who drank 5 to 6 glasses of water daily, had a 60 to 70% reduction in the risk of fatal heart attack compared to those who drank considerably less. The finding held after controlling for diet, exercise, body weight, and smoking status. Water. Not juice, not herbal tea. Water, consumed at a volume that most Americans do not approach. The mechanism is not mysterious. Adequate hydration maintains blood viscosity at the level that allows the cardiovascular system to function without the clotting risk that accompanies thickened blood. Dehydration, even mild, chronic, subclinical dehydration of the kind that most sedentary Americans experience without noticing, increases blood viscosity, raises the concentration of clotting factors, and creates the hemodynamic conditions under which arterial events become more likely. The Adventist women were not carrying hydration trackers. They were drinking water throughout the day because their religious practice explicitly promoted it as part of healthy living, and because the community around them did the same. A habit that costs nothing, requires no preparation, and that most people in the surrounding San Bernardino County were simply not practicing consistently enough. The cardiovascular data from Loma Linda suggests that this single variable, daily adequate hydration, may have contributed more to the community's cardiac outcomes than many of the dietary interventions that received far more research attention. Habit 3. Fish. The pesco-vegetarian advantage. The Adventist Health Study. 2. Tracking 96,000 participants across 5 dietary groups produced a finding that complicated the prevailing narrative about plant-based diets and longevity. The group with the best all-cause mortality outcomes was not the vegans. It was the pesco-vegetarians, those who ate a plant-based diet with the addition of fish, consumed regularly but not daily. For women specifically, the pesco-vegetarian pattern showed a 19% reduction in all-cause mortality compared to non-vegetarians, the largest reduction of any dietary subgroup in the cohort. Better than lacto-ovo-vegetarians, better than vegans, better than semi-vegetarians. The mechanism likely runs through the EP and DHA omega-3 fatty acids that fish provides in the pre-formed version that the body can use directly, without the conversion step required from plant-based ALA that vegans depend on, and that many people perform inefficiently. These long-chain omega-3s reduce the systemic inflammatory markers that drive cardiovascular disease, support the neurological function that determines cognitive outcomes in older age, and maintain the cellular membrane fluidity that affects virtually every biological process. The Adventist women consuming fish several times weekly were following a dietary pattern their community had developed over generations, plant-based at its foundation, with fish as the primary animal protein. The biology simply reflected what consistent, moderate fish consumption alongside a predominantly plant-based pattern produces across a lifetime. Before Habit 4, subscribe to Longevity Code. Every week we decode one blue zone, one population, one system. Always peer-reviewed, always practical. Habit 4. Breakfast as the largest meal of the day. In a culture where dinner is the centerpiece of daily eating, the largest meal, the social meal, the meal that extends into the evening, the Adventist pattern inverts the entire structure. Breakfast is substantial. Lunch is moderate. Dinner is small or sometimes skipped entirely. This is not an intermittent fasting protocol. It is not a caloric restriction strategy. It is simply the traditional Adventist meal timing that the community has followed for generations, based on the principle that the body should receive its primary fuel during the hours when it will be most active. The Adventist Health Study documented that this meal timing pattern was independently associated with lower body mass index across the entire cohort, after controlling for total caloric intake. The same calories, consumed earlier in the day rather than later, produced different body composition outcomes. The mechanism runs through circadian insulin sensitivity, the biological reality that the same glucose load produces a measurably smaller insulin response when consumed in the morning than when consumed in the evening. The pancreatic response to carbohydrates follows a circadian rhythm that peaks in the morning and diminishes through the day. The women of Loma Linda were eating their most substantial meal at a time when their insulin sensitivity was highest, their digestive enzyme activity was most robust, and their bodies were best positioned to use the fuel rather than store it. They were not doing this because of metabolic research. They were doing it because it was how the community had always eaten. Breakfast together, a modest lunch, and a light evening meal that left the body fasting for 12 to 14 hours before the next morning. Habit 5. The Sabbath. One complete day of rest every week. This is the most unusual variable in the Loma Linda longevity data, and in many ways the most important. From sunset on Friday to sunset on Saturday, the Seventh-day Adventist community in Loma Linda stops. Not in the way that most people take a weekend day off. They stop completely. No work, no shopping, no competitive activity. Church attendance, family meals, walking in nature. The structure of the day is built around rest, social connection, and the absence of the performance pressure that drives chronic cortisol elevation in the surrounding culture 6 days a week. The Adventist Health Studies identified regular religious practice and community engagement as independent variables associated with longevity outcomes. Even after controlling for the dietary and behavioral factors that already distinguish this population. The Sabbath is both a practice and a social structure. It is a mandatory weekly cortisol reset embedded in the community calendar so completely that individual willpower is not required to maintain it. Everyone around you is doing the same thing at the same time. The reset happens automatically. The 2012 PLOS-1 research on telomere length found that women in chronically high-stress environments showed biological aging equivalent to 10 additional years compared to those in low-stress environments. The Adventist women were not managing stress through meditation apps or breathing exercises. They were living in a community where 1 day out of every 7 was structurally protected from the demands that produce chronic stress accumulation. Not occasionally, every week, without exception, for a lifetime. Now, the absence. Everything described above is what these women do. What they do not do is equally documented and equally significant. No alcohol, no tobacco, no caffeine, no ultra-processed food. The Adventist Health Studies confirmed that each of these absences contributed independently to the longevity outcomes observed. But the most important finding may be the one that is hardest to replicate without a community built around the same values. Individual habits can be adopted. Individual absences can be maintained through discipline. What the Loma Linda data suggests is that the most powerful longevity variable may not be any single food or practice, but the social environment that makes consistent behavior the default rather than the exception. The women of Loma Linda do not require willpower to avoid alcohol at a dinner party. Their dinner parties do not include alcohol. They do not require discipline to rest on Saturday. Everyone they know is resting on Saturday. The biology reflects not just what they eat and how they rest, but the community that makes both inevitable across a lifetime. Which of these 5 habits could you realistically add to your week starting now? Tell me in the comments. Subscribe to Longevity Code. Next week, another Blue Zone, another system, another community that figured out something the rest of the world is still trying to optimize its way toward. Always the science. Always something you can start this week.